Or how Harry Nilsson's recording of Badfinger's Without You would be transformed in Lavinia Greenlaw's young consciousness as not so much a song as a continuum, a booming tunnel of desire through which we flew like static. Because by the time these sources made it to my eyes and ears, they read respectively as an embarrassingly brazen sexual self-advertisement enacted by one handsome man and 3 jazz dorks, and as a saccharine dose of quasi-sexual mawkishness so far from what I recognize as acceptable or pleasing evocations of desire as to constitute actual parody. The distinction here isn't about vicissitudes of musical taste or vagaries of gender. Like anyone with a radio, I have also felt myself flying through that same tunnel of desire, no matter that I was propelled by different songs. This sensation transcends generation and genre and is one of the great thrills of being alive. But time changes some things irrevocably. The gulf between my perception of the Doors now and the one that pulled Didion into the torpor of their recording studio in 1968 has everything to do with time. Not because the Doors were valid 40 years ago and are not valid now, but because my understanding of Jim Morrison is necessarily filtered through the gestures of the pop stars who have followed, plenty of whom have embraced the naked torso of his legacy. But some, whether by way of aesthetic preference or simple discomfort, left the erotic politicking to the erotic politicians and kept their shirts on, so to speak. Time, as Vladimir Nabokov reminds us in Ada or Ardor, is a fluid medium for the culture of metaphors. And speaking of metaphors, if popular music is a city, everyone who lives in any of its many neighborhoods has an equal right to claim it belongs to them and they to it. Though I had visited this city all my life, I never felt like I truly belonged there until the brief commercial heyday of alternative rock in the early 90s, hastened by the success of Nirvana. I realized that admitting this here, and here originally meant the pop conference, but it actually works here in Seattle, in Elliott Bay, as well. I realized that admitting this here is akin to outing yourself at the Republican National Convention. So I'll keep it brief. But you know how people in the music business used to, and certain quadrants of the press used to talk about how the mainstream success of underground-oriented bands formed a bridge between the subculture and the mass culture? Well, that bridge was built for me, and I crossed it, and I apologize. Though I'm not sorry. Newly immersed in this city of indie rock, I am kind of sorry for that phrase, I took immense pleasure in seeking out the experiences that would allow me to claim it as my own. Like many people who discover something anew, I assumed not only that it had been placed there specifically for me, but that now was the most important time a person could possibly be discovering it. I don't know why it was that these sounds were the ones that drew me in. It's not as though I had never liked the Doors. I had loved the Doors. I had liked a lot of music. But I had never felt like it was made for me specifically, that it belonged to me and I to it, that we were contemporaneous, consanguineous, until the early 90s, with its explicit and implicit backward reach to the late 70s and mid-80s. Can it have been a coincidence that this was the first moment I noticed that the bands making the music I loved tended to be fully dressed? Of course, there have always been shirted artists. And not just the association or whatever. The unlikely rock star has been with us as long as the born kind of rock star. For every Elvis Presley, a Buddy Holly. For every Bob Dylan, a Leonard Cohen. For every Jim Morrison, a Van Morrison. Okay, maybe not everyone, but still, it's not like it was ever a question of Mick Jagger or nothing. But rock's defining gesture, in primary and secondary source material alike, was always a sexual leer, a sexual urge, a sexual seduction, a sexual plaint, a sexual attack, sexual primacy. The hormonal explosiveness that attended the birth of rock and roll plainly went through many changes and refinements as the decades wore on, and the form became institutionalized and classed up. By the time it trickled down to me, the idea that there might be something other than sex for rock stars to be peddling, other than, not necessarily more than, and frequently in addition to, felt completely new and alien to my conception of rock music expressly as an outlet for raging hedonism. This was not a school or movement. It was more like just a group of musical artists who happened to have in common the impulse to subvert, to question, to confront, and or to ignore, rather than simply to embody, the relationship of rock and sex. So the mask worn by the iconic and sub-iconic makers of this music, from Johnny Rotten to Ari Up, to Michael Stipe, to Bob Mould, to Morrissey, to Kurt Cobain, to Calvin Johnson, to Liz Phair, to Kathleen Hanna, to Paula Jean Harvey, to Stephen Malkmus, advertised disdain for the cliches of rock virility, offering in their place a short but potent list of abstractions and deconstructions: anti-sexuality, homosexuality, pansexuality, non-sexuality, in quotes, sexuality, et-sexuality. But these alternate models also became masks for embarrassment about, veiled and unveiled hostility toward, meretricious reliance on, and general discomfort with sex of any kind. Nirvana's quest to derail the hairspray element of heavy music, hard rock as the term was understood before metal moved in, is what Bob Christgau called it in his Consumer Guide review of Nevermind, remains well documented but worth remembering, because they were a total inversion of what a band was supposed to do with fame, and set the stage for the idea that indie music was in the on-deck circle, which wasn't really true. It was in the hole. They wore dresses. Hole with a lowercase h. That's a pun, not a reference. They wore dresses, they kissed each other on TV, they made sex sound like putrescence. They gave interviews in which they used the word feminist in a positive way and sang about rape as if it were bad. They were, in short, unheard of. The first time I heard Nevermind, I was stoned on the floor of an NYU dorm room on Halloween with a girl, and I'm not bragging, it just seemed so appropriate not to make out. That was just the beginning of my 90s. Of course, you could do it to Nirvana. Nevermind, anyway. It's hard to imagine getting sexually aroused by In Utero, but maybe, I'm sure many people did. But it also seemed like a violation of something. Nirvana reignited a culture of refusal that extended to everything you might choose to extend it to. Sonic Youth had totally gone pop, kind of, and without getting into that whole discussion, there was no shortage of sex confusion and confrontation for the casual listener on an album like Dirty. Kim Gordon's growl voice on Swimsuit Issue and Drunken Butterfly extends the creepy sexual harassment, seduction burlesque of kissability from Daydream Nation, while lines like, "I believe Anita Hill," and "I've been around the world a million times, and all you men are slime," make no secret of where Thurston Moore's sympathies lie. More disturbingly, Lee Ranaldo's wish fulfillment gets inside the mind and mouth of a stalker in an eerily convincing impersonation. Desire is a subject here, but also a scold. There was Pavement, the definitive 90s band, and my favorite, a notoriously arch and intellectual group whose classic rock gestures were always at least 80% critique. When they talked about girls, the girls were figurative, always an abstraction of the idea of girl, distilled from other songs they were thinking of: Summer Babe, Loretta's Scars, The Queen of the Castle Pasadena, California Thrill. They elevated diffidence to the vaunted place normally reserved for longing in pop songs, not knowing what to feel instead of sweet emotion. Confessional moments, such as they were, consisted of lines like, "There is no castration fear," and the far more revealing, "I trust you will tell me if I am making a fool of myself." One of their most conventionally soulful vocals concerned the absence of room to grow in a leather terrarium. Sex was utterly beside the point. Neutral Milk Hotel, album 1, side 1, song against sex. So why should I lay here naked when it's just too far away from anything we could call loving, any love worth living for? So I'll sleep out in the gutter, you can sleep here on the floor. Even when Bikini Kill released a song with the unambiguous title, "I Like Fucking," flip side, I Hate Danger, on which they declare a belief in the radical possibilities of pleasure, babe, and that there is anything beyond troll guy reality. The lines sound like encouragement from the singer to a female friend, as if to say, it's possible to feel this way despite everything. Its desire is a statement of purpose, not as seduction. Another key line, "Just because my world's sweet sister is so fucking goddamn full of rape, does that mean my body must always be a source of pain?" It's not exactly touch me.